John, he has taken the name of St. John the theologian, and Dr. Peter Michael Harris. He has a Bachelor in Art and Psychology from Southern California College, Costa Mesa, a Master's of Arts, U.S. International University, San Diego, Doctor of Philosophy and Psychology, all magna cum laude, as Father Blasco said, U.S. International University. He's taught extensively as a professor in too many colleges to name in Orange County on many subjects, testing, a lot of psychological testing. He's published on attention deficit disorder, so he'd be a great resource to our community in that as well. He's had a Jungian, he's taught in Jungian dreams. He's been certified as a Jungian analyst, and when I got to know him, he went to Newport Psychoanalytic Institute and did his certification as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist there. We've come to develop a very strong bond as both being Christians and psychoanalysts. Sometimes they don't go together, but we became brother and sister in Christ and now in Orthodoxy. Through our about 4-year friendship, I started as his clinical supervisor and now as his friend. And he's beginning to write about the blend between Orthodox spirituality and psychoanalytic understanding, and I highly recommend it to you. And I know he has much to share today in his new writing inspired by the Holy Spirit. So, Dr. Stephen and John.
Well, hello, and it is really a blessing to be able to call you brothers and sisters in Christ as an Orthodox Christian. And wow, 3 sacraments in one day. I'm very overwhelmed, and I'm very grateful to be a part of this gathering here in the Nativity of the Most Holy Theotokos. I came here first on the Feast of St. Sava last January by way of invitation of Dr. Katina, who, just to the side, Dr. Katina is just an amazing supervisor and direction in both psychoanalytic thought but also orthodoxy. I think some of you might know her from previous talks here. Gave some talks here before. Shortly after the celebration, I was to meet Father Blasco, who has made me feel so very welcome and has been a wonderful guide in the Orthodox Christian faith. He seems to be a wonderful example of humility. He seems to think I don't learn anything from what he says. He's always examples and simple questions that just have my mind. He asked me what was the greatest virtue, and I'm like, it's a trick question. It's love, isn't it? And, and of course, he was to teach me about humility. And none of it happens. Nothing's possible without humility, right? Is that the idea? Okay. The door doesn't even open to God. Yeah, the foundation. So I'm very grateful for this. I'm also grateful to Nicholas. Is there any Nicholas? Nicholas Tamaras. Oh, he's gone.
Nicholas is the best.
We'll see him later on video, I guess.
He's coming.
Nicholas and his wife Mary have been very helpful to me, encouraging me, and giving me support, feedback, and help through learning fasting, and so I'm very grateful for all that you've given me. So thank you for making me feel very welcome. I often wonder what it is like to be Serbian, and interesting for me to be sort of an outsider. However, when Father Blasco announced my baptism here at the Divine Liturgy last week, I could feel all your smiles and embrace, and I didn't feel so different. I felt a part of, and so I appreciate your welcome. So I've now been coming here almost every Sunday since last January, and before I talk to you about psychology and faith, I would like to tell you a little history about my religious experience. My journey to Orthodox faith is actually much longer than just a few months since the feast of St. Saba. I'm a fourth-generation Episcopalian. Episcopal, you may know, comes from the Greek, which loosely translates into bishops or church with bishops. The Episcopal Church is the American extension or version of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. So I have a liturgical background that is sometimes Protestant, sometimes Catholic, kind of riding between the fence of Catholicism and Protestantism. Sometimes it's jokingly called Catholic light, but for various reasons. So this was my early exposure to liturgy, different kind and less elaborate than yours. Many of the words of the Divine Liturgy sound familiar to me, and I could say the Nicene Creed without looking into your liturgy book, with the exception of having to not say the Filioque, the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father only. Yeah, okay. Anyway, I'm going to jump to the early days of my psychology practice. I was undergoing what is called a Jungian analysis, a study and therapy that focuses upon one's spiritual center. During that time, I came across Vladimir Lossky's The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And I have to admit, theology has never been a very interesting subject to me. But this book really spoke to me. I thought this is a theology that I like very much, and it fits my soul, my mind. So when I read Father Lossky's writing about theology of the Eastern Orthodox Church, Athanasius, Dionysius, the Rapagate, St. Gregory, several St. Gregories, I don't know how to say it, Nisus, Palamas, and others, I thought I found the perfect theology and one that fit kind of my mystical temperament. Lossky writes, if God has given us in the church all of the objective conditions, all the means that we need for the attainment to this end, we, on our side, must produce the necessary subjective conditions. For it is in this synergy, in this cooperation of man with God, that union is fulfilled. You know, some of you know probably, St. Seraphim of Saros saw the works of prayer, fasting, vigils, and all the other Christian practices as aim at acquiring the Holy Spirit. And thus, union with God, uniting with our divine spark, a Greek word, scintilla, for our divine spark, are words that really spoke to me, that our spirits long for God and desire to be united with God, and that we undergo a process of deification. I think now, where I'm at today, I think I've come to realize that my whole life has been struggling and sometimes suffering with the feeling of separation from God. And so the idea of uniting with God, being with God, and learning how to spiritually walk with God, feel united with God in ways that the Orthodox faith have instructed me, has been very important to me. I told Father Blasco when we were meeting when I first came that I've found that it's intolerable to feel separated from God. It's become my focus to be with God. So this is a long history for me. I've always had been kind of a monastic in my inner spirit. And I thought I'd found perfect theology, on paper at least. But that was back in the 1990s, and I was at a loss as to how would I pursue this interest. It seemed to me a lot of, like your church, a lot of Orthodox churches, had a certain cultural bent or identity, and it didn't feel as accessible at the time. So up until this point, while I was in college, I had attended a deacon's ordination at a Greek Orthodox church in Oklahoma. Back in the 90s, I attended a Russian Orthodox wedding in the late 1980s at Cathedral Los Angeles, Holy Virgin. Yeah. So I enjoyed those very much, but they were different experiences and far away. So in retrospect, perhaps short-sightedly, I placed the idea like this, all this great stuff on a shelf, and kind of just moved on. And the Orthodox world was just something in my mind. It wasn't something that I really participated in. But I was talking about it with Katina, Dr. Katina, when we were in supervision, and I was telling her. She was telling me she was coming down to attend the service, and she invited me. As I came to the first Divine Liturgy here, I was just so taken away. I scribbled a little note to her, and I said, "I'm carried away." It just I felt so like I was in the perfect place to experience my faith and connection with God. I felt like I was intoxicated and feeling like I was being elevated into heaven itself. It's very emotional for me. I was really pleased to be here. Let's see. Because the people here, and Dr. Katina, and Nicholas and Mary, and many of you that I've met, and certainly Father Blasco, have bridged this gap that I felt about. I didn't have a big cultural difference. I just didn't know how I would fit into such a community, and you've really made it possible. As well as I think God brought me here. So this process has me reevaluating what I do spiritually and professionally all over again, particularly as I prepare to speak to you. And the topic which I'd like to talk about is kind of an introduction. I'm not going to cover a lot of territory, but maybe it'll be a bridge to other talks about the subject if an interest develops. So what I'm going to talk about today will mainly start to talk about depression, but the perspective I'm talking from we could use to talk about anxiety or trauma and a variety of other issues. But the matter I'd like to address today is psychology, but also how the topic of psychology, more particularly psychotherapy, might relate to our faith. Psychology and religion, especially Christian religion, have an uneasy past, full of all kinds of suspicions towards each other. I think my Protestant minister grandfather was praying for my soul not to go to hell when I commenced studying psychology. So I felt very supported and encouraged. However, that's a long discussion. I won't spend time talking about that. I would like to suggest that we begin to try to explore the potential for psychology to have a complementary relationship with our faith, just as Dr. how do you say his name? how it's suggested that science and religion can have a complementary relationship with each other. Keeping in mind perspectives like in Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all things. And St. Paul's, I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate to do. And perhaps more poignantly in Proverbs 3, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. We may be perplexed or even bewildered when we start thinking about the human mind. We think of all the self-deception, places our mind can take us. But we are left, regardless, as human beings, we're left with our thoughts, different ways that we feel. Elder Thaddeus has wisely instructed us that our thoughts determine our lives. Therefore, to be human places a burden on us to understand our thoughts, see how they work, as I would suggest, as a Christian, and find how the mind works so we can place it under discipline and relate to God more completely. You might say, do we want our thoughts to serve the good, to serve and be in right relationship with God, or what is the alternative? We are still thinking beings, so we have minds, and so what will we do with what we think? St. Paul says the mind that is governed by the flesh is death, the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. So Christians may struggle with, but know that, like in John's Gospel, Jesus says, apart from me, you can do nothing. This is a very important piece of what potentially is a complementary relationship between psychology and our Christian faith, Orthodox faith, is that it's all, we need Christ. Additionally, Father Blasco, in his newsletter about the Incarnation, says emphatically that we cannot exist without God. It's a state of non-existence without God. We cannot exist without our Creator. So I would urge that we need to understand our minds so we can participate in our deepest connection with God. If we're not aware of our minds, we may be less aware of how we stray away from God. For me, this is one important area where psychology and theology are complementary. Our awareness can really assist us in our walk with God. Some of you here have engaged me about the differences in issues between faith and psychology. I have some thoughts about how psychology and Orthodox faith might be complementary. One way of seeing psychotherapy as it relates to religion is to see the psychotherapist as someone who helps those who know not what they do, in the words of Christ on the cross. And for God, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So this would be one way of thinking about the unconscious part of the mind. There are some things we do that we're not sure why we do them. To put it simply, we may sin or miss the mark because we're unaware. So I'm not referring to matters where we slip and make mistakes or we get distracted momentarily, but matters which we characteristically keep avoiding and have an inability to address some part of us. And if we knew more about it, we might be able to direct it further into spiritual discipline and the areas where we can make mistakes because of our lack of awareness. Is this pace okay? Am I going too fast?
No, it's great.
Okay.
Speak up a little more.
Speak up louder? Okay. So therapy often helps us, or it has the potential to work through our issues that hold us back and sometimes take us away from God. We might say that psychotherapy has the potential to be the handmaiden to confession. I think some words should be said about what goes on in therapy that would aid awareness. As people of faith, I want you to know that we have a concept in psychotherapy that is called the analytic third, which is a way of saying when two individuals participate in the process of therapy, a third entity or awareness about what is going on develops. as a metaphor, it's like when two chemicals are mixed together, something else is produced. So applied psychologically, the idea is that the product of the work of two individuals produces an awareness not found in either individual. When you hear this, two people gathered together, does it make you think of anything from your Christian background? Christ is in the midst of them. Exactly. So it's a very similar concept. It's not a theological one, but it's just sort of maybe walks up to that idea of Christ's presence. So, and Carl Jung used to use the quote from an ancient Latin saying that I cannot say in Latin, but the essence is, bidden or not bidden, God is present. God is everywhere. So, some of you may say that this can occur in any relationship, such as friendships, but this is where therapy is actually different. In one way, it's not a social encounter, and close in the way that friends are, supporting each other. And another way, depending on the work that is done, it is very intimate, and much more so than most friendships. This brings me back to the work of therapy and the Orthodox faith. A process of increased awareness of ourselves as subservient to confession and our ongoing relationship to God, penitence, and so forth, has the potential for us to learn, especially when it comes to matters that continue to impede our ability to function effectively in life and our walk with God. Psychotherapists are not confessors, but their work can make the Christian aware of things that can more complete and aid to what is discussed in confession. Okay, so I have set out to discuss psychological symptoms and some of their meanings, possibly. If today you came hoping to get some answers, I'm pretty sure that you're going to be disappointed. There's no method here, or Dr. Phil, or anything like that. Neither do I think it's fruitful to become, maybe you could say, psychological Methodists, following prescribed steps. This is how it's always done. I hope I'm not offending anyone with saying that, but I thought it was safe here in the Orthodox Church. So this will be an exploration, at least a little bit, about symptoms. I have as the goal for this exploration to begin to have us ask ourselves what our minds might be up to. So you might say, as I said briefly before, how does our mind work? Okay, in one way, we can't know that all the time, but it's an important question. It's very elusive. Perhaps we can only truly know what we know right now. And even when we do remember things, we keep remembering it. Okay, we reinterpret. If people think about their past, we are reinterpreting the past all of the time. Here's an example of how we interpret things over and over. A study was done where subjects were told that two cars smashed into each other at an intersection. When asked later about the details of the story, an overwhelming majority of the subjects report there being broken glass at the scene of the two cars colliding. There was no mention of windows smashing or anything, but just the word smashing creates the image of broken glass and so forth. And so right away we insert our own minds in there and we interpret it our own way. So while this isn't overwhelming evidence, we can see how even our memories are always being modified in the present. Psychological symptoms, emotions, and even our bodily reactions can be triggered by emotions that all typically potentially inform our thoughts, or even inform us so that we avoid our thoughts. Avoiding our thoughts and our feelings can be another symptom. You steer around it. You avoid it. So let's take a look at the meaning of some words within psychology. Psychology comes from the word psyche in the Greek, which means soul. And ology has its root, I believe, in the word logos, which conveys meaning, not the capital L divine logos of Christ, but related to meaning or the study of. So we have a word in that relates to our symptoms and disorders and stuff, psychopathology. And this isn't really important to understand this word, but I'm going to play with this word a little bit. It's broken. You can break it down into three parts: psyche, soul, and pathology comes from pathos. Who can help me out with pathos? What is that?
Emotion.
Emotion. Sometimes it's suffering, pain, sadness, pity. Thank you. Very good. Yeah. I'm going to grab suffering for my own purposes, my own poetic license here. And then the ology, which is, again, about meaning or study of. And so playing with this word a little bit, I'll stand out of the way here, but you can say the word is the meaning of the suffering of the soul. Okay? And that's what I want to talk about today, is an introduction into trying to decode the meaning of suffering. We experience symptoms sometimes because it's a signal to us. Emotions, especially negative ones, especially uncomfortable ones, can be disturbing. So, however, they're just another branch of our nervous system and our bodies. So I'd like to start with the question, are symptoms like anxiety or depression bad? Or could they be of any use at all? And so, to aid us in thinking about that, when you get a cold or influenza, you develop symptoms, usually including a fever, body aches, and so forth. And the fever, while it's uncomfortable, is part of the infection, but we also have a low level of white blood cells during the fever. And white blood cells are increased and restored because of the fever. And so the symptom is also part of the cure. So I'd like you to just kind of hold that in your mind and think about that. That sometimes what's uncomfortable is good for us. It's not good to just like take a bunch of aspirin and try to not have get rid of your fever. If you do that too fast, the healing process gets inhibited. So again, I hope you can see where I'm going with this. I'm saying with this, is there something useful in symptoms the way a fever is useful? The psychoanalyst James Hillman said that we need our psychopathology because it's our soul's way of signaling to us that something is going on that needs to be represented. It needs to be characterized or displayed to us so that we can understand. And if we accumulate too many symptoms and they go ignored, they can progress into what we call disorders, personality problems, and they can profoundly affect our well-being. If we have a cluster of symptoms and a lot of these problems, relationships, spirituality, and so forth, can be inhibited. So it can be important to address these things and not let them just get worse. So I promised to talk about depression, and I'm like 2/3 of the way through this. I'll get to depression. Depression has been called the common cold of psychological disorders. Separate from all clinical ideas about it, the word just means held down, held back. You know, you're pushed down. Okay, and so let's think about it that way for a while. When confronted with feeling down or sad, or perhaps feeling like we're held back in life, it can be important to ask ourselves, what is holding me down? What is holding me back? I'd like to give you an example. I once worked with a woman who complained of chronic emptiness, often with depression. She had no idea why she felt this way. So rather than ignoring it, or, it's easy to ignore something, it's like, I don't even know how I can help her. It's just like she just feels empty, she feels down. But we decided to explore it. And as we explored the emptiness, it was interesting that we learned that she remembered a story of being a fairly young child and telling everyone about her experience of being visited by a beautiful butterfly, how it landed on her, and she interacted with it for a while before it flew away, and she was amazed. So she gleefully told everyone, but everybody that she told, the feeling wasn't returned. Okay, in fact, it was diminished. So, although this was later determined not to be an isolated event, it wasn't like we discovered that and her life was forever changed. We did discover that it was kind of typical of her early experience growing up. We explored how her experience was full of life and anything but empty. And so this kind of opened the door. The emptiness itself opened the door into more fullness. Her experience of the butterfly was full of life, enchantment, and wonder, and it was the response to her that was so empty and devoid of celebrating her amazing experience. So apparently she had internalized this kind of empty, callous, devaluing response in the place of the appropriate one that just sort of mirrors or reflects back the experience of it. This and other experiences like them became a source of despair and a depressive shutting down of her that took her on a very negative path. But our exploring it allowed her to reopen the whole issue. This became the beginning of many explorations and discoveries around her experience of emptiness, something that was accurately reflected in her mind as a symptom of emptiness of her experience. It wasn't something that made her bad or something wrong with her. And I don't think it was important for her to make the people that didn't respond to her very well bad either. That wasn't going to help her either. It was just, that would keep her as a victim. So what was important is, by discovering this, a rich inner life began to emerge where she only had felt a void and had just shut off her interacting with other people so that she wouldn't experience more pain. The pain of getting all excited and happy and then being afraid someone would shoot it down. So her symptom of emptiness was an amazing clue for us in our work. If we were to look together at her story from an Orthodox Christian perspective, I would ask you what parts of her soul or her mind became accessible to God and to herself in a way that she wouldn't have been able to if I just opened that door. So, symptoms mean things. This exploration did not lead us to blaming problems or others or to some insight that changed her life overnight, but eventually towards looking at how she was shutting herself down and so that she wouldn't feel more pain. The emptiness which remained for her was perpetuated by being afraid to share her experience more. Also, this young woman had, I think almost everybody's heard of this these days, something like. So in this case, individuals who have this sort of Asperger or kind of autistic part of their minds, they're very sensitive to others' reactions. And she retreated further into a real deep world of inner fantasy, not accessible really to others, and I suspect if she were religious, it wouldn't be part of her spiritual walk. It would be a retreat from everything. Okay. Thomas More, writing in his book Care of the Soul, has a chapter on the gifts of depression. In his chapter, he writes of a man who comes to his therapy session all down, and he apologizes to his therapist saying, well, when I come back, I'm sure I'll have something more interesting to talk about. But Moore writes that he encourages him and says that he's glad that he has come in this way because he can experience a side of him that he would not normally see. Sometimes there is something there in the darkness for the light of God to penetrate. Learning about why we are depressed has the potential to unlock something inside that we hold back. Another gentleman that I see had been so bent on avoiding the experience of pain or disappointment that he would continually talk himself out of the most pleasurable experiences. He had a pretty good amount of money, so he would go buy like the best Harley Davidson, and it would just sit there in the garage and collect dust because he would talk himself out of going for a ride or doing anything fun like this. And he was always, stopping himself to do this because he was afraid of some kind of disappointment, and it felt so absurd to me, but that's what he did. Well, by exploring this, we were able to come to see that he had failed to grieve at some past experiences and past pains. And so what he was doing is he kept pushing his pain from the past off into the future, like he's just kicking the can down the road. And so, while it seems so absurd, this, ungrieved material, this pain that he had, he just continued to avoid it forever, seemingly. So, you might even say that he was projecting his past into the present and to the future. So this exploration of his symptoms have led him to help not go back to the past, but learn to experience himself in the present. Okay? This is really important. Sometimes people think of therapy as, you're dwelling on your past. And what is really a big challenge is, in the words of the great psychoanalyst Bion, that psychoanalysis is not about the past or the future, but right now. I'm paraphrasing. And that is really important, is to be able to learn to live in the present. So this exploration of his symptoms have helped him to let go of the past and learn to experience himself in the present through letting himself move through it and become more alive in the present. Again, as an Orthodox Christian, you might see how being able to stay present and listen to God can change if we see how our mind works and the way it can avoid things and stop long enough to open it up in a different way. The Jesus prayer would be a great example of steering away from these thoughts and back towards God. You see, this man that I'm talking to you about could not let go of the past because he was avoiding those feelings and dragging them into the future. I'm not sure whether you would be thinking this by now, but as I wrote this, I had the thought that that everyone starts to think or ask questions. Well, how do I keep from dragging my, the past into the present and so on? I can't answer this, but I'm wanting to illustrate that it can be productive to learn about depression or different ways that we think. These cases that I talked about was their thought process and how they would address things. And it's what I'm hoping in talking about this is that you will become curious about how your mind works, what it tells itself, because that can be very useful in terms of putting it into spiritual discipline. There's much more to explore regarding these and other topics, but I wanted to address some of what psychological symptoms might mean and how our minds work, and that our symptoms that we're experiencing in the present are very important in terms of becoming aware and how we can be more disciplined spiritually. And I'd like to submit to you the possibility of thinking about how being aware of our mind is very important in terms of the Holy Spirit's instruction to us in our being closer to God. Thank you.